I mean, it's Biden versus Trump.
Yes,
we know that.
It is.
What do you say to voters who are upset that those are the two choices?
Get over yourself. Those are the two choices. I don't understand why this is even a hard choice.
That was Hillary Clinton on The Tonight Show discussing the upcoming 2024 election, where Trump and Biden will be going head-to-head once again for the chance to lead the country.
But many viewers were quick to point out the shortcomings of the two-party system and electoral college. Should voters just get over themselves, as Hillary Clinton says, even if they don't actually support the two major candidates that are running? What can voters do when they don't feel like they're being heard by either side? And what is at stake?
Well, the feelings surrounding the elections are complicated, especially during a time of international turmoil regarding the murder of over 34,000 Palestinians in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. According to new data for Progress polling, 3/4 of Democrats and the majority of all voters support a ceasefire.
In this episode, we'll take a closer look at how the feelings surrounding Gaza have trickled down to how voters feel about the upcoming election, particularly Muslim voters in Michigan, who have harnessed the power of their vote to send a message. Michigan has always been crucial to the outcome of the presidential election. Once a Democratic stronghold, Donald Trump won the state in 2016 by just 11,612 votes. And in 2020, Biden won with over 150,000 votes. Many Muslim voters in Michigan have been critical of Biden's refusal to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. One group took matters into their own hands. The Listen to Michigan coalition announced the launch of the Uncommitted National Movement prior to the primary presidential elections.
The Uncommitted Movement, which was led by Muslim voters, capitalized on the power of the vote. And more than 100,000 Michigan voters picked the uncommitted choice. Without Muslim support in the state, Biden risks potentially losing the election altogether. And in a time when college campuses have been rocked by the pro-Palestinian protests, can both parties really afford to ignore the Muslim vote?
In this limited election series podcast by Immigrantly Media, we're going to take you on a different journey. What we're here to do is provide you a small picture from a large frame. The pictures we want to paint are of minority communities, immigrants, communities of color, specifically in the battleground states at the heart of this year's election season. History and culture are complex and multifaceted. Within the broad context of the United States, we're focusing on a smaller picture. Our approach instead is to talk about what issues matter to these communities and why those issues matter to them. What are the key defining moments in these voters' lives? Those are the stories we want to tell.
We're your co-host, Juan Diego Ramirez.
And I'm Sarah Sadwani, and this is Nationally. JD, I am so excited to be doing this podcast with you.
And likewise, Sarah. I appreciate your work and look forward to our conversations.
I'm a political scientist as my day job. I'm at Pomona College, where there's been a whole lot of activity in the last year. And in particular, my research specifically looks at elections in communities of color. You know, most of my research has looked at Latino and Asian American communities, emerging immigrant communities. And I do a lot of work right here in Los Angeles as well.
Well, I am a New York-based journalist, raised in Los Angeles, and I mainly focus on Latino issues for the majority of my work. That's what I've done in the past. So, Sarah, why did you decide to host Nationally?
You know, it's really exciting to have an opportunity to create a platform where we can talk about the election. There's so much coverage of a presidential election, but I think oftentimes a lot of that coverage ends up taking a look at voters and immigrants and communities of color in this way that just sort of thinks about whether or not they're going to come out and vote. And, you know, we often only think about the Latino vote, Asian American vote, right up before an election. But these are communities that are living and thriving and have issues that matter to them long beyond the election cycle.
Like you, I myself also like to dive into conversations of how complex our communities are. So I'm excited to sit down and dive in.
I've never lived in a world where you point at the voters and blame them if the candidate does not win. The candidate needs to self-reflect and look in the mirror, in this case, be it President Biden.
That was Abdullah Hammoud, mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, home of one of the largest Muslim populations in the United States. Nearly half of Dearborn's 110,000 residents are Muslim, and the city is the Central Democratic Party's strategy for 2024, with Biden's planned visits to the state in order to win the Michigan vote.
Abdullah Hammoud took office in 2022 at just 33 years old and has been President Biden's top critic for his refusal to call for a ceasefire. When Biden was asked by a reporter in late January of 2024, "Are you concerned with the Arab American votes voting for you during this election because of Gaza? Many say they will not vote for you." He said, and I quote, "The former president wants to put a ban on Arabs coming into the country. We understand who cares about the Arab population," referring to the executive order Trump installed on his first day in office, which barred many individuals from Muslim countries from entering into the United States. In other words, Muslim voters face the impossible choice between a xenophobic Trump or Biden, who refuses to address mass Palestinian deaths by the State of Israel. This is a really tricky piece because, yes, of course, Trump is no friend to Muslim Americans. And yet, at the same time, it can also be true that Biden isn't necessarily doing enough to stimulate the Muslim vote or to be responsive to the needs of Muslim Americans as they are defining them on the ground. I think this is one of the ongoing issues that Democrats have with communities of color. The Democratic Party today is largely this loosely held coalition of various communities of color. Especially since the election of Donald Trump, we've seen Black Americans who have had a long relationship with the Democratic Party, Asian Americans, Latinos, the majority of all of those groups, and now even Muslim Americans leaning their support toward the Democrats. And yet, time and time again, we see Democrats kind of take advantage of those voting communities and not really be responsive to the substantive requests and representation that communities of color are asking for.
In January, Mayor Hammoud and other Michigan leaders refused a meeting with President Biden's campaign amid his refusal to call for a ceasefire in Gaza.
We want to go to the polls with hope, inspired, in support of a candidate. This idea that you draw people to the ballot box by getting them to say, "I am the lesser of two evils," or out of fear of who might assume the office, that's not as inspirational as one of hope.
Shortly after this interview, Mayor Hammoud, along with other state leaders, declared their support for the Listen to Michigan Uncommitted campaign.
If a sizable portion of the Democratic electorate here in Michigan votes uncommitted during the primary, that will be a 5-alarm fire for the White House and for the Biden campaign.
The movement is meant to signal to Biden that his presumed voters are not happy with his refusal to call for a ceasefire in Gaza.
One of the uncommitted voters was Democratic U.S. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who was censored last November after speaking out about the indiscriminate murder of Palestinians in Gaza.
When 74% of Democrats in Michigan support a ceasefire, yet President Biden is not hearing us. This is the way we can use our democracy to say, listen to Michigan.
Her sister, Layla Alabid, who is an organizer for Listen to Michigan movement, says that this is not a niche issue. It's an anti-war campaign focused on stopping a genocide that is massively unpopular in the United States.
And as of April 17, the Uncommitted movement has brought in nearly $500,000 and 500,000 votes across other states, including Minnesota, Washington, and Wisconsin. For the Muslim voters in Michigan who are leading this movement, they want to feel like the candidates have earned their vote, says Slate reporter Ayman Ismail, who interviewed Dearborn residents.
I think a lot of them are awoken to the fact that neither party really serves them. The precipice of what they want is they want to be taken seriously as a voting bloc.
In other words, many are reclaiming the power of their vote. Sarah, let's talk about this.
This presents a really challenging situation. Michigan in particular. I know that this uncommitted vote is occurring in other places, Minnesota, Washington State, and that's consequential, of course. But Michigan in particular plays this incredibly important role in the Electoral College. But it seems like neither party is really listening to these voters. So what ends up happening here? How do we move forward? And what happens when leaders don't listen to these demands?
This is a great reminder to the 2016 election when Bernie Sanders ran as a Democrat for president. And he did that because nobody was listening to the rest of Americans. It seems like we're at that point again. We're at this moment where Americans have to choose a candidate they don't like. Trump is not a candidate with solid ground. He flip-flops on a lot of issues, and he has even flip-flopped on Israel.
We have these two major candidates, Biden and Trump, and we've had them before back in 2020. The difference is in 2020, we had record turnout in the United States. I mean, oftentimes we are not seeing very high turnout, even in presidential elections, but 2020 was the real exception because voters really felt that there was a lot on the line. You felt like you got behind Biden this time around because Donald Trump was such a bad alternative. My guess is we're not going to have that record turnout again in 2024 that we saw in 2020. I'll also say, just because I'm a political scientist and a total nerd, that this comes back to a sort of age-old classic conversation about what is representation. What are our leaders supposed to do? Are they supposed to be delegates of the people and just go and reflect the will of the people? Or are they trustees of the people? Are they sent to office and they end up being these sort of wise sages who make these decisions on behalf of the people, even if the people don't always agree with them? And I think in this instance, that is most certainly the posture that Biden has been taking towards Muslim Americans, saying, I know better here. Let's be clear, Muslims in Michigan can make or break an election in 2016. Trump won the state by just over 11,000 votes. And now let's not forget, there's a lot of different constituencies in the state of Michigan. It's a classic working class Rust Belt state. Labor is incredibly important here. And Trump has done very well in the past.
We will fight for America like no one has ever fought before. 2024 is our final battle. With you at my side, we will demolish the deep state. We will expel the warmongers from our government. We will drive out the globalists. We will cast out the communists, Marxists, and fascists.
In a way, Michigan is this quintessential swing state where tiny margins of votes can make all the difference. And the Muslim population is one of the most influential groups and fast growing groups in determining that outcome. I think it's important that we take a closer look at the history of the Arab community in Michigan, which has historically been a magnet for many Arab Americans. The first period of Arab migration to Michigan occurred in the early 1900s. As the automotive industry in Michigan boomed, people all over, including Arab families, sought jobs with competitive pay. Many of these families were coming from Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. According to the U.S. Census, Detroit's Arab population more than tripled from 1910 to 1930, totaling nearly 1.6 million people at the time. But then there was a second wave of Arab immigrants that did not arrive until after 1965 due to the immigration ban that was put in place in 1924. Many Middle Eastern families migrated to Detroit in the decades after the ban was lifted, most due to conflicts in their native country, including Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. I also think it's important to note that much of the Muslim population that lives in places like Dearborn came to the U.S. escaping many internal conflicts. Despite these rocky reasons behind Muslim migration to the U.S., many of these immigrants and refugees still look to Michigan as its new home. Michigan now has one of the largest Muslim populations in the United States, with significant communities in cities like Dearborn and Hamtramck. Coincidentally, the two places where Biden was beaten by the uncommitted vote.
There is so much history here that the residents of Michigan have with connections of where they came from and where they're at now and under the conditions they're living in with the things that are happening at this exact moment. Does that mean Biden takes Muslims serious? What does this mean?
I think a broader question might be, does American politics take Muslim Americans seriously? Donald Trump came into office in 2016 with a largely anti-immigrant message. So if we're thinking really broadly, there's a whole swath of Americans who aren't too pleased about the direction that the United States is moving in demographically. We've been hearing since back in the mid-2000s that by 2050, the United States is going to be a majority-minority nation. And that has caused a whole lot of unrest and backlash. After 9/11, there was an incredible period of Islamophobia throughout the United States.
9/11 brought the same loss felt by every American, but it also triggered an onslaught of anti-Muslim sentiment that has only risen in the decades since.
We saw the indefinite detention of anyone of a Muslim background or if South Asians. We saw hate crimes occurring against anyone presumed to be Muslim, even amongst Sikhs who are not Muslim at all, but might just be wearing a turban, because there's such a lack of understanding of the various cultures and a lack of understanding of Islam and why even many Muslim Americans would be coming to the United States. So yes, I think this is a problem in the Democratic Party, not taking Muslim Americans seriously. But this is one of the first times that I can really recall Muslim Americans standing up in a loud way and demanding to be heard, not as foreigners, but as Americans.
It's like the children that grew up under the Muslim ban grew up, and now they're taking charge of their own futures. We want to be clear. The topic of the uncommitted vote isn't just hinging on the Muslim Americans in Michigan.
Down with occupation! Down with occupation! Up with liberation!
That's the sound of protests at Columbia University in New York, where I live, where hundreds of students have gathered to protest continual attacks on Gaza. More than 100 of them were arrested in the first days of protests.
Mayor Hammoud told Business Insider that, quote, the media tends to overlook how multiracial, multi-generational, multi-faith, multi-ethnic the movement turned out to be. It downplays the issue of Gaza as solely an Arab and Muslim issue. But young voters, especially college students, are key players in this uncommitted movement too. College students across the nation are organizing against Biden's refusal to call for a ceasefire.
My name is Soph. I am with Jewish Voice for Peace at Columbia, and I am here today because I will not stand by while thousands and thousands of people are dying.
Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Within the last month, hundreds of students across college campuses have organized to protest the murder of Palestinians in Gaza. This includes Ivy Leagues like Columbia University campus, which led a national movement of encampment. These protests have even been compared to the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of the past.
Let's anchor our conversation a bit into the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, where the uncommitted vote far outperformed. Ann Arbor has been a place ripe for student activism of all kinds, from the anti-Vietnam War protests to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's even the birthplace of the 1960s New Left ideology, which grew out of one of the major student activist organizations, Students for a Democratic Society. Now, it's a place where both Palestinian and pro-Israel sentiments clash.
And in January 2024, the school's Senate Assembly passed a resolution calling for UMich to divest from companies with financial ties to Israel. According to the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, divestment has been a tool of social change at the university level.
Free speech and divestment is at the forefront of many university conversations, and it has been no different at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Despite the Senate Assembly passing a solution to hold a college-wide vote on divestment from companies with financial ties to Israel, the vote was canceled by the institution due to it violating their election code.
According to the Michigan Daily, and I quote, Derek Peterson, UM History and African Studies professor, began the discussion of the Senate vote by denouncing the university's cancellation of the vote as an overreach of their power and a violation of the university's principle of diversity in thought.
I think in so many ways, Gen Z is a fascinating group of young people. Many of them were born after September 11th, so they don't remember really that history. And as young children, they lived through the time period of the first Black president, only to have Donald Trump then be elected. They lived through a worldwide global pandemic. They faced enormous economic insecurity from the Great Recession. And they grew up in an era of school shootings, mass shootings happening in malls and in movie theaters. I mean, this is a community that has seen a whole lot of threat.
Yeah, I mean, this generation, unlike previous generations, had to grow up quickly. I mean, we're talking about a generation that saw school shootings in kindergarten, Sandy Hook, that grew up from there to high school shootings, to a Great Recession, as you mentioned. So I don't find it surprising that this generation is very informed about what's going on in the world, because they had to grow up very quick, very fast, at a very, very young age. So for them to finally come of age and mobilize in the way that they're doing right now, it's not surprising.
At the end of the day, this is a generation that is incredibly involved. They have already been making history just over the last couple of months on college campuses. And their experience in this time period is going to define this generation for sure. That's what makes 2024 and every election that comes after different. Young voters, and young Muslim voters especially, are shifting from passive viewers to political actors. And if their concerns are ignored now, they will grow up to remember it at the voting booth.
Sarah, this is really great. Thank you for dropping all those jewels. That was a lot of good stuff. I learned a lot through the episode. Thanks for listening to our very first episode of Nationally Podcast, brought to you by Immigrantly Media.
We hope you liked the episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
Each episode will take you behind the poll numbers and talk to you about the people at the center of them.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com or reach out to us on our socials @immigrantlymedia on Instagram and @immigrantlypodcast.
And I'm at JuanDR47 on X and on Instagram.
And you can follow me @Sarah Sadwani.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Shay Yu. This episode is written by Andrea Flores with the research assistance from Nicholas Black. Our sound engineer and editor is Steve Martin. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. Thanks again for listening. Take care.